1807 into an old Virginia family, Robert E. Lee was the son of Revolutionary War hero Henry Lighthorse Harry Lee. Lee attended the U.S. Military Academy at West Point, spending most of his career in the Engineer Corps before distinguishing himself in the Mexican War. After serving as superintendent of West Point, Lee transferred to the cavalry in 1855. He learned of his father-in-law's death in 1857 and returned home.
Though never a large slaveholder himself, Lee managed over 60 enslaved workers as executor of Arlington. He was ambivalent about slavery, calling it a moral and political evil, but he also believed that only merciful providence should determine the institution's fate. When Lee learned of Virginia's secession on April 19, 1861, he spent a long night agonizing over his future and that of his family. He deplored the idea of secession, but realized he could not raise my hand against my relatives, my children, my home. He resigned from the U.S. Army and sided with Virginia.
With Arlington lost, the Lees were without means of support after the war, so Lee accepted a job as president of Washington College in Lexington, Virginia. He spent his last years helping to bridge the divisions still scarring the nation, counseling those who harbored animosity that it was the duty of everyone to unite in the restoration of the country. Lee died at the school on October 12, 1870, and was buried there.
Pierre Charles L'Enfant is buried in front of the Arlington House. He was an engineer, artist, soldier under the direction of George Washington. L'Enfant designed a city responsive to the aspirations of a nation which looked to the future. He envisioned the nation's capital as a living and permanent symbol of the United States.
George Washington Parke Custis, the builder of Arlington House, was Martha Washington's grandson from her first marriage. After his father died when he was only 6 months old, Custis was raised by the Washingtons. His only surviving child, Mary, wed Robert E. Lee in 1831.
Life at the Arlington House was distinguished by warm hospitality, close family relationships, religion, and education. Visitors were greeted in this hall by the enslaved butler/coachman Daniel Dobson. Guests were political or artistic friends of Mr. Custis, military friends of the Lees, social acquaintances, visiting relatives, or total strangers on pilgrimage to see the Washington treasures kept at the house. No one was turned away.
The Lee and Custises entertained their guests in this parlor and gathered as a family for morning and evening prayers. This room witnessed several special occasions as well. Robert E. Lee and Mary Anna Randolph Custis were married here on June 30th, 1831, underneath the archway.
Robert E. Lee oversaw the decoration of the white parlor, and the room strongly reflects his personal tastes. It was used as a storeroom for almost 40 years, housing old furniture while serving as a painting studio and later on as a playroom for the Lee children. In 1855, the Lees redesigned the room, turning it into a formal parlor where they entertained guests, read, and played music.
The morning room served as a parlor, formal dining room, and painting studio for the Custis family before the home's completion in 1818. As her arthritis worsened, the elder Mary Lee relied this room as an office to answer mail, paint, and manage the affairs of the house.
Intimate family meals were held in this dining room, while larger dinner parties and social events were usually held in the morning room. In the
and Martha Washington. Slaves who worked in the fields, such as Lawrence and Jim Parks, grew corn and wheat, cultivated vegetable gardens, and sold flowers and produce in the markets of Washington. House slaves such as Daniel Dobson, Eleanor Harris, and Ephraim Derricks worked as housekeepers, valets, cooks, drivers, laundresses, and gardeners.
In 1804, Custis brought his bride to Arlington. When Mrs. Custis arrived at the plantation, she devised a plan for the gradual elimination of slavery at Arlington. Mrs. Custis provided the slaves with a rudimentary education for the purpose of religious instruction and as preparation for their eventual independence. The enslaved community also received medical care from the Custis family's physicians. Slave families earned money by selling surplus vegetables from their individual gardens. In their leisure time, they took part in pastimes such as swimming and ice skating. Custis rarely sold his slaves, and thus families remained intact. Far from powerless, many slaves possessed significant authority and sometimes dictated the daily routine at Arlington. Yet slaves were legal property. They possessed no rights and could not be sold at moment's notice.
Although the enslaved house workers enjoyed better living conditions than those in the field, their lives were closely intertwined with those of the Custis and Lee families. Serving the family all day long and often into the evenings, they were involved in the most intimate moments of their owners' lives, from birthing and nursing babies to caring for the sick and dying. Favored slaves enjoyed special privileges. Some were allowed to make overnight visits to friends or family nearby. They had more possessions, better clothing, furniture, and food.
They had more independence but less time to enjoy it. The hours when they were not working for their master must have been precious to them. The first generation of Arlington slaves were born and raised at Mount Vernon. George Washington Parke Custis, their master, inherited them from his grandmother, Martha Washington.
Unlike the planters in the lower South, the Custis and Lee family grew mostly food crops on this 1,100-acre plantation, as well as at two other sites. George Washington Parke Custis limited the cultivation of cotton and tobacco because they were labor-intensive and exhausted the soil.
Custis did not make enough money from his other crops to support large numbers of slaves, thus he was not as dependent on slave labor as others. It was his intent to free his slaves, which he did through his will 5 years after his death in 1857.
Robert E. Lee's resignation from the U.S. Army and his family's evacuation from Arlington House transformed the lives of the enslaved people living there, leading them to attain freedom and pursue new opportunities.
Liberty for each, for all, and forever. William Lloyd Garrison, Washington, February 24, 1866.